It's well known by now that the left is now in favor of defunding the police. Not that this is a new movement for them. They have a long and storied history of hating the police. We saw a few years ago how they basically formed the BLM movement, Black Lives Matter movement, around the notion of pigs in blankets, which basically meant dead cops. They wanted to kill cops. In fact, in the name of BLM, there were cops that were killed. Remember this? Where they proudly proclaimed pigs in a blanket shortly after a cop was murdered by a Black Lives Matter activist? No one should be surprised that they hate cops. Therefore, it makes perfect sense that they would want to actually defund the police. In fact, defunding the police is a far cry from actually wanting to kill police. So, in a way, perhaps they've become a little bit more civilized in recent years. This is their more marketable stance, if you will. Here we have the nation saying that liberals should not be afraid of calls to defund the police. The increasingly popular slogan is expanding the nation's long overdue debate about what public safety really means. Well, I think it means me protecting myself from you. So, in a way, defunding the police makes quite a bit of sense. As the nation's designated liberal hand-wringer, I admit I've been concerned about the rapid spread of the demand to defund the police, which sociologist Alex S. Vitale argues for persuasively in our digital pages last week. I have worried that its radicalism jeopardizes the growing mainstream support for police reform in the wake of George Floyd's apparent murder by Minneapolis police 2 weeks ago, and the subsequent police violence against those protesting that crime. It has, of course, become a simplistic gotcha question for some reporters and news anchors to shoot at the Democratic politicians, especially since a veto-proof majority of the Minneapolis City Council pledged to disband its police department Sunday. Oh, I love it. Let's read on. But I've decided to calm down and trust the wisdom of the activists as well as some of the leading politicians who've been working on this issue far more closely and with far more on the line than I have. There is right now a productive tension between liberalism and radicalism, as well as establishment insiders and activist outsiders, the kind we talk about in history. Labor unrest in the 30s, helping to lead to a New Deal reform, civil rights unrest in the 60s, culminating in the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act. Yeah. I wouldn't really say that there is a tension between liberalism and radicalism. In fact, I would argue that they are two peas in the same pod. The liberals of today are anything but. They don't actually espouse for the ideals of liberalism. Liberalism is about freedom. It's about individuality. These liberals are conformists. You conform to their way of thinking or you die. They actually care very little about individuality unless it's surface deep. They try to segregate people by any means necessary, whether it be the color of their skin, their sexual preferences, whether they're fat, whether they're skinny, whether they're this, whether they're that. We see them do this with literally any possible metric. Their goal is to divide and conquer. It should also be noted that the labor unrest that led to the New Deal reforms and the Civil Rights Voting Rights Act, those really had nothing to do with each other. The labor unrest in the 30s was economically founded, had nothing really to do with race at all. The civil rights unrest in the 60s, by the way, was led by the Republicans against the Democrats. It was the Democrats who spent the better part of the 100 years following the Civil War trying to find new creative ways to enslave black people. They couldn't do it while calling it slavery, so they tried new angles, such as economic slavery, welfare, Jim Crow laws, and gun control. The Civil Rights Act, while important and mostly backed by Republicans, it unfortunately did not solve the problem. In the end, the Democrats won. They managed to return blacks to the plantation, and they've been there ever since. We're dealing with it today. Of course, white backlash to the 60s civil rights progress, as well as sometimes destructive protests rising crime, led to the election of Republicans, Richard Nixon, and Ronald Reagan. Well, actually, it was really their support of the Civil Rights Voting Rights Act. Republicans looked really good at this time, while Democrats certainly did not. Republicans were given control after Democrats spent the better part of 30 years running the country into the ground. You add FDR, you add other presidents such as Lyndon B. Johnson, who famously said, I'll have these Negroes voting Democrat for 200 years. So Republicans got a boost because, quite frankly, the Democrats had failed their mandate. And some of us older folks are still living in the shadows of those traumas. Yes, the trauma of great economic prosperity under Reagan and Trump. It's so terrible. And then there was Richard Nixon, whose only crime was paltry in comparison to the crime of the modern day Democrats. Nixon more or less had to resign because he may or may not have spied on a political candidate. What does this sound like? The Democrats spied on Trump and they get away scot-free. In fact, they make it a campaign issue. The Democrats believe what they did against Trump was actually decent. Why? Well, because Donald Trump's a Russian agent. They ran on this. So what traumas exactly are you speaking of? Richard Nixon's crimes were minor. Reagan had no crimes. In fact, he led us to the greatest economic prosperity era of our time. And it should be no surprise that Donald Trump, a Reagan-esque president, would also have his own economic boom under his belt. It's funny how much cognitive dissonance these liberal writers have. Like they live in an alternate reality. It's totally make-believe. Everything this person says is validated only in his own mind. Moving on, I've come to realize part of the problem is that much of the liberal democratic establishment came of age politically, as I did, in the shadow of the Reagan Revolution, when Republicans came to dominate not only policy but language itself, especially around crime, welfare, and the role of government. Well, that's interesting because the greatest crime reforms since the Democrats last had power back in the 1930s and 40s was actually done by Bill Clinton. If you look historically, the only ones who have tried to regulate crimes and expand crime laws to include such things as black ownership of firearms is the Democrats, not the Republicans. I can't find a single person who isn't a frothing at the mouth liberal who thinks the Reagan years were bad years. It really paved the way for the modern day prosperity movement. After Republicans won the White House in 5 out of 6 elections with a brief pause for Jimmy Carter, some Democrats worried they'd never get it back. Well, I mean, after the disaster that was the 30s and the 40s under the Democrats, it's no wonder that we weren't really in a rush to get back to a Democrat-controlled country. President Bill Clinton led us out of that wilderness, partly by making the many compromises with the dominant GOP worldview that progressives now loathe, or at least lament. Really? Because, far as I can remember, Bill Clinton was absolutely despised by the GOP at the time, and he was not known for playing fair. He's also the one that, with the Democrat majority in the second half of his term, issued a very sweeping overhaul of violent crime reforms, which predominantly targeted black people. But even Barack Obama, like me, graduated from college into cramped, fearful Reagan-era political activism. Really? Like what? Lower taxes? More individual prosperity? The ability to think and speak freely? The ability to believe in a Christian God? You know, like the Constitution says we have a right to do? That partly accounted for his justified fear of a GOP backlash, futile determination to work with Republicans. Now some of us cringe at every slogan that might potentially frighten off the elusive swing voter. From Medicare for All to abolish ICE to now defund the police. Well, that's because these are all terrible slogans. I don't know why you would have these slogans. Medicare for All sounds awful. You know what I'd rather have is deregulated health care. I'll pay for my own health care. It wouldn't be so damn expensive if it wasn't so heavily regulated. You know, you're all too busy trying to find a way to justify paying someone's $300 aspirin pill when they go and stay overnight in a hospital. Instead, you really should be asking yourselves why the aspirin costs $300 to begin with rather than just trying to make somebody else pay for it. Abolish ICE? Yeah, great idea. To now defund the police? Yeah, great idea. But remember when Abolish ICE was going to doom Democrats in 2018 and how they took the House? Well, actually, that's pretty standard. In fact, it's almost ubiquitous that the opposition party takes the House after the opposing party wins the presidency in the previous election. Look right here. This is from Cook, the Political Report. 2018 midterms are a vivid example of the macro opposing the micro. History tells us that the president's party almost always loses House seats, which has happened in 35 out of 38 midterm elections. That's 92% of the time since the end of the Civil War. In the Senate, the pattern is not quite as strong. Since 1913, when the 17th Amendment was adopted and the direct election of senators began, the president party lost seats in 19 out of 26 elections, or 73% of the time. What does this tell us? Basically, that the Democrats actually underperformed historically in the 2018 midterms. They should have taken more House seats. Furthermore, the Republicans exceeded historical norms by bucking the 73% trend of losing Senate seats as well. What this tells us is that the Republicans overall actually had a very strong 2018 that bucks historical trends going back to the Civil War. If anything, it did hurt Democrats. Abolish ICE and their other stupid rhetoric cost them what should have been a much larger gain of representation in both chambers of Congress. Now, let's review this article because it was pretty fluff on anything factual and actually got quite a few things wrong. I actually think it's a great idea to defund the police. And the reason for that is because whoever thought it was a good idea to outsource the enforcement of justice to the government was an idiot. The government's the one who we should be enforcing justice on, not who should have control over the enforcement of justice within the population of people. It is the constitutional mandate that every person look out for themselves, their neighbors, their family. It is not the police's job to protect you. You are responsible for your own protection. Defunding the police will finally force that constitutional mandate. In the absence of the police, neighborhoods and families will be forced to defend themselves. Unlike the police, these neighborhoods and families, they're not going to be subject of overly burdensome regulations. They won't have body cam footage. And unlike the police, they will have the full weight of the Constitution supporting their actions. Rioters who think they can get off easy with the police, maybe with a warning or a night in jail, they will find no such luck with suburban America. Breaking into someone's home is going to get you shot and killed. It's going to get your friend shot and killed. These rioters are going to learn the hard way that when justice is dispensed not by a regulated police department, but instead by a self-regulated militia, their antics are going to be punished to a greater extent than any law enforcement agency in the country could ever hope to enforce. I, for one, support this. This is perhaps the most constitutional and libertarian action that any party has taken in decades. This will absolutely solve the crime issue, not make it worse. If they thought police officers were killing blacks en masse, just wait until they try to burn down the home of some white American in the suburbs. If anything, the police have caused more harm than good by protecting groups like this from themselves and from those who want to actually enact violence against them. What we've seen with all these police forces across these cities is that they're too limp-wristed to actually take real action. They just let them go, burn down buildings, riot, deface property with no consequences. Now, in the absence of the police, when middle America knows that they're not going to be able to rely upon the police to solve this, they're going to have to take matters into their own hands. And like most things, the government almost never does their job well, but the private citizens always do their job well. Cleaning up the streets is just going to be the next thing that private America is going to have to do on behalf of the government, since the government is incapable of doing its job. I guarantee you that within 6 months, these liberals are going to look at this and they're going to regret it terribly. The numbers of blacks that are going to be killed in home invasions or looting businesses is going to drastically skyrocket, because these business owners and homeowners are no longer going to have to worry about being investigated by the police to determine the legitimacy of their actions. There will be no police to show up, no one to help save these people from their inevitable fate. Abolishing the police will achieve only one thing, and that is the restoration of justice to America. Many people will die, and I suspect most of them are going to be black, because they are the single most violent criminal demographic in the country. Anyways, that's all I have for you. Thanks for watching. Take care.